Good morning, and then thank you very much for the kind introduction. And as an organizer, I welcome all of you for this summer school. And maybe in the previous 4 days, the lectures are so mathematical and then theoretical. So your brain may be a bit overloaded, but hope today's my talk is not so heavily mathematical. So hope you can relax your brain by listening to my lecture, right? Okay, so the topic I was asked is like brain-inspired AI. Yeah, so maybe all of you know that deep learning has its origin in the brain's architecture for sensory processing. So that was a very successful case of a brain-inspired AI. But what else can we further learn from the brain for building a next generation AI? So that is something we want to discuss during this lecture. Okay. Right, so as Makoto said, yeah, OIST Graduate University started in 2011, and then we started to take a PhD students from 2012. But effort to build this university started in 2004. And at that time, there was a call for applications as like a PI or guinea pig for testing whether you can sample some researchers and then from around the world and put on this island and whether they can do a world-class research. So I volunteered for such a subject, and then I was accepted and started a lab here. But at that time, there was no campus. So we rented some space in a prefecture, like an incubation facility, and then started our research activities. Yeah. And also, another thing we started is a summer course. This is called Okinawa Computational Neuroscience course. It started in 2004. This is just a 20-year anniversary of this course. So idea is that to be the new university, you need to recruit excellent people. So thanks to this and other effort, we succeeded in attracting highly motivated young people and also the renowned researchers as lecturers. And some of them decided to even stay here for their career, right? Okay, so and I'm very glad that we are hosting a new kind of summer school here. It's a bit cold to call summer, but still warm enough compared to the rest of the world. So I hope you enjoyed the stay here and also make a good network with your friends here. Okay. All right. So at the OIST, my lab is called the Neural Computation Unit. And we have like 3 subgroups working on like a neurobiology experiments and then neural modeling and the theory and also robotics experiments. Right? So those shown in red are PhD students. So at OIST, in average, we have like a 3-to-1 ratio for the students and faculty. But because I have wide topics, my lab is a bit like well populated by the students. Right? Okay, so and the concept of OIST is to make it a very international and interdisciplinary university. Right? So we do not have any kind of department organization. And also more than half of the faculty and the students come from outside of Japan, right? So and because our lab was the first lab at OIST, so I try to make our own lab kind of interdisciplinary. So one of the aim of our lab is to creating flexible adaptive systems. Another is like understanding of brain's mechanism for learning. So on one side, we do machine learning and robotics research. And on the other side, we work on neurobiology experiments, mostly using rats and mice. So, but the common theme in our research is reinforcement learning. So next week, Amy will present about reinforcement learning in more detail. But reinforcement learning is kind of a learning of actions. So this agent can be a human or animal or a robot or software that monitors the state of the environment and sends out an action, right? And then it gets kind of reward feedback, evaluating how good or bad this agent is performing. And the aim of reinforcement learning is learn action policy, which is a kind of mapping from the state to action to maximize the acquired reward. So this kind of a setup can be used for different kinds of animal and human behavior. So in the case of animals, the reward can be food or water or avoiding pain. And in the case of humans, in addition to that, money or social status can be a very big source of reward. But we may apply kind of similar like a computational mechanisms, and maybe for the living system, similar like a brain architecture. Right? And also this reinforcement learning can be a kind of online adaptive optimal control. So there's a lot of use in engineering and industry. Right? So coming up with an efficient algorithm of reinforcement learning for artificial agent, that's a very important topics in machine learning and computer science. And also understanding the brain's circuit and the molecular mechanism for reinforcement learning is a very important topic in neuroscience. And once you make certain progress on one side, maybe that can give us some insight to the other. Or once you hit a certain problem in one side, maybe that will give us a new problem setup for the other. So I think it is beneficial to work on the reinforcement learning in artificial agents and natural agents in a parallel manner. So that's how we planned our theme of our lab. Right? Okay, so then because I'm working on both sides of machine learning and neuroscience, many people ask, what is the relationship between AI and the brain? So one idea is that to make an intelligent machines by electronics, we should not bother biological constraints like neurons or a particular organization of the brain. But some other people say that because we already have a very good implementation of intelligence in our brain, why don't we reverse engineer such a successful system? That is also a quite a reasonable argument. So in the history, so these two extreme views can kind of swung back and forth. And then, for example, in the previous century, the AI was coding the human knowledge and expertise. So in that case, there was no strong reason to directly learn from the brain's organization. But in this century, the AI is about learning from big data, for example, from the internet. So, and in doing that, the like brain-like architecture, like deep learning, made a very good success. So that is why many people think that learning from a brain for building a next generation AI might be helpful, right? Okay. So for example, in the case of like visual pattern recognition, the very important observation in brain science is that in the visual cortex, particularly these experiments are done in the cat visual cortex. There are many neurons. And then by measuring the activities of those neurons by presenting different visual stimuli, the Hubel and Wiesel found that those individual neurons in the visual cortex respond to particular local feature on the retina. Right? So like orientation or movement direction. Right? So and then the computer science researcher like Frank Rosenblatt came up with an idea that by combining such local features appropriately, you may be able to build a pattern recognition machine. So that was the kind of first like machine learning mechanism called the perceptron. And then the neuroscience is further found that how those such feature detectors are organized, and then found that those feature detectors are not fixed. They are kind of learned by visual experience. For example, if you raise a cat in an environment where there are only vertical stripes available, so the researchers found more neurons respond to the vertical edges, right? So that means not only the final layer, but the lower layer neurons may be able to learn by experience. From such a knowledge, the theoreticians try to come up with a learning algorithm for multi-layer neural networks. And for example, my previous mentor, the Shinichi Amari, was one of the first people to come up with such an algorithm. And then also in Japan, the Kunihiko Fukushima was a pioneer in this multi-layer unsupervised learning mechanism known as a neocognitron. Right. Yeah. So in such a multi-layer neural networks, bottom layers would capture like a lower level local features, and then higher layer are expected to capture more global abstract representation. And then indeed, neuroscientists found such a higher level feature representing neurons. For example, the place cells in hippocampus, it was awarded the Nobel Prize several years ago. Such a neurons in the hippocampus responds to the time when the rat moves to a certain location in the environment. And also, some other people found so-called face cells. So in the higher visual cortex, the neuron particularly respond to the face, or in some cases, face of a particular person or a face with a particular expression. Right? So such a very high-level representation can be found. Right? And then more recently, the multi-layer neural networks are used practically for like different kinds of object recognition. And then people found that something like a face cell or like a cat cell in the upper layer of the deep neural network. So I think there has been a very kind of a productive like interaction or co-evolution of the development of machine learning algorithms and discovery of the new facts about the brain. Right? So my own research is not on the sensory side, but the motor side. I've been working on reinforcement learning. So in that field, the very important early work was done by psychologists. So they analyze the behavior of the animals, right? So, and for example, the Pavlov is well known for his idea about conditioning of the reward. So some kind of bell is followed by the food reward. So as soon as the dog hears the bell, he starts to salivate. Right? And that is known as a kind of classical conditioning. So further, there are concepts of so-called operant conditioning. So if the animal does something and that action is followed by reward, the animal will try to repeat such an action, right? So that kind of feature is known as like a law of effect by the theoretician Thorndike. And then the Skinner did a lot of experiments with the pigeons and other animals. And in those studies, what was discovered is the prediction of the forthcoming reward by from a certain sensory signals or a certain action is a very important component in learning behaviors. And then on the computer science side, the early pioneers like Andy Bartow and Rich Sutton had such a knowledge of psychology, and then build like a modern form of reinforcement learning called temporal difference learning. So in which prediction of the future reward takes a very fundamental role in learning new behavior. And then neuroscientists also perform a more like a modern method, not just observing the behavior, but inserting electrode in the brain and monitor the activities of neurons. And then the most striking finding was by Wolfram Schultz, who recorded the neurons in the deep part of the brain called substantia nigra, where there are kind of neurons which release the neurotransmitter called dopamine. And then what he found is that those dopamine neurons respond specifically to the reward, like a food or water, but not just the reward itself, but the prediction of the future reward. So that's a very important finding on the neuroscience side. And also, my current colleague, Jeff Wickens at OIST, who was previously in New Zealand, found that some neurons in the brain has a specific form of the learning called dopamine-dependent synaptic plasticity. The learning of these neurons are supported by the release of dopamine. So such a knowledge promoted people to think of like brain implementation of reinforcement learning. So our specific hypothesis is that the part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which receives the strong dopaminergic input and have a dopamine-dependent synaptic plasticity, would play a very important role. And such like a theoretical models motivate people to perform further analysis. And then our lab and others found that indeed in the basal ganglia, there are neurons responded to the prediction of the future reward. And more recently, the reinforcement learning is like a core component of artificial intelligence. So in the mid of last decade, the people at the DeepMind developed the methods to combine reinforcement learning with deep learning. And that made a big success with the human level performance in Atari game first, and then Go and chess and shogi and many other games. And also the reinforcement learning is also used in services like a ChatGPT these days. So I think also in the case of like action, the interaction between the neuroscientists and then machine learning researchers had a very important role. Okay. So then several years ago, we started like a new research project called Correspondence and Fusion of Artificial Intelligence and Brain Science. So this was a 5-year project, and then recruited about 30 laboratories across the country to talk about this topic. And then the major topic of discussion is what should we further learn from brain in addition to deep learning and reinforcement learning. And of course, there are many kind of discussions about what is realized in the brain, but not yet realized in AI at the moment. So for example, the energy efficiency is a very important topic. Right? So maybe you heard in some of the talks, these days, the AI models have become very big and then consume a lot of power for training. And so compared to that, our brain is supposed to consume just about 20 watts of power, right? So how can we realize such a power efficiency? That's a very big question. Another important point is the kind of data efficiency. So the successful implementation, like GPT, is based on the crawling almost the entire internet and utilize all the text information human civilization has produced. So compared to that, we learn decent capability of language and knowledge about the world from a much smaller amount of data. So how such a data efficiency is realized? For example, in a case of AlphaGo, they use the simulator to play the game of Go millions or billions of times, much more than any human player can experience in a lifetime. Right? So such a data efficiency would be a very important topic, and probably creating world models and running mental simulation, or properly utilizing modularity and conditionality and learning to learn might be a very important components in the data efficiency. And another important difference in the autonomy and sociality. So today's AI program mostly built for particular purpose, right? So like recognizing the object within the given image, or producing a certain response to a text input, or producing an image from a certain prompt input. So, but the behavior of humans, animals are kind of open. So they are free to do whatever they want to do, as long as they can stay living and also produce offspring for the continuation of the species. And then while having such autonomous capability, so most animals have a social capability. So coordinate well with the other agents, or even the creature in other species to form like stable ecology, so that they can keep surviving and then reproducing. So and such a social capability is also very needed in AI agents as well, right? So maybe you heard the news, like a certain chat program produced a very unacceptable outputs, or like in some cases, if the AI programs overruns, it may cause a certain side effects, which is not good for the society. So how to make a good balance between autonomy and social awareness, that is something very important in designing a future AI. Right? So maybe there are some other points. So hopefully, if you can take time, so we can discuss about other aspects as well. And then in the rest of the talk, I would touch upon these topics, mainly on this data efficiency and then autonomy. So this topic of energy efficiency is not really my area of research. But for example, we are involved in Japan's supercomputer project. So we previously had a big computer called K, and now we have a big computer called Fugaku in Kobe. And then I was involved in a project of using such a gigantic machine for neuroscience. And my colleague did a kind of benchmark of how large neural network you can implement in such supercomputers. So we took like a spiking neural network model. So we try to model the brain in the single neuron resolution. And then even in the previous generation of a supercomputer, we could run simulation of a spiking neural network of like 68 billion neurons. And in the new current supercomputer, Fugaku, we can run like about half of scale of the human brain. So in terms of the memory and the computing capacity, it is not impossible to simulate the human brain in a single cell resolution using today's supercomputer. But there's still a big problem. So we don't know how exactly our neurons are connected. And our connection is not static. So how they change by its own dynamics and also sensory motor experience. So the really reproducing a human brain on computer has a very long way to go. But another important topic, difficulty is the power usage. So these huge supercomputers these days kind of consume like almost 1 power plant of energy. So compared to just 20 watts of energy usage, they use a lot of energy, right? So, but these are supercomputers built for general purpose computing may not be very good for the brain simulation. So, yeah, so this is about the supercomputer Fugaku implementation. So the many people are interested in producing hardware specific to the neural network or brain simulation. So those chips are called neuromorphic chips. So there are different kinds of implementation, like digital implementation and analog implementation. So and those chips try to achieve energy efficiency, for example, by locating the memory and the processing unit very close by, and also for the communication, not instead of sending the floating point numbers all the time, send a single bit spike as necessary in time. Right? So different the IT giants like IBM or Intel kind of working on such neuromorphic chips. And also recently, the new type of device called the memorister, which mimics the functioning of the synapse, like a variable connection between the cells, is attracting attention as a new way of energy efficient computation. So this is still a quite ongoing effort. And then in addition to this kind of a device level architecture, so the neurons have its own morphology. Probably on Monday, you had some talk by Tomoki Fukai. So using the communication within the, even a single neuron can be a quite capable computing machinery. So by combining electric and chemical signaling. So such like a design of the system which can realize energy efficient learning, that is also a very important topic of future research in terms of a brain-inspired AI and brain-inspired computation. Okay, so then I will talk about the topic of like data efficiency, right? So and there are a lot of work on this topic. So in many machine learning presentation, we see the learning curve, which algorithm learn faster to reduce the loss function. But in this talk, I will mostly talk about my own experience in reinforcement learning. So this is kind of my the start of my research career, which I did in my like undergraduate graduation thesis project. Right? So this was the kind of middle of 80s when the like personal computers became available to like undergraduate students. So I tried to do something interesting. So because I can monopolize a computer, I want to use it for controlling robot. So this is a very small robot, like a 10 centimeter long with just 2 motors. And then I wanted to make a robot that learned to move because I was very much into like a ski racing. So I was interested in the motor learning. But at that time, there was no textbook in robot motor learning. So I tried to think, I started to think what is necessary to let the robot learn new behavior. So the idea is that probably we first kind of represent the motor patterns using some numbers. So in this robot, the robot posture is defined by the angle of the two joints, and then moving the foreleg, hind leg, foreleg, hind leg. So using 4 angles, you can define the cyclic movement. And then we also can change the period of such a cycle. And I could define the quite variety of a movement using just 5 parameters. And then the question is find a good point in this 5-dimensional parameter space. So to do that, we have to evaluate the goodness of the locomotion. So that's why I attached this rotary encoder with like a circular like a rubber eraser to measure the speed of the robot. Right? And then the algorithm I implemented was really simple. So starting from a random setting with these 5 parameters, the robot moves and then measures the motion speed. And then give a random perturbation, and then again measure the speed. So if it is faster than before, take a new value. If it is the same or like worse, step back to the previous one. So it's a very, very simple algorithm, but still the robot could find out the variety of locomotion patterns which you saw in the movie. Right? So that was the kind of a start of my research career. So at that time, I didn't know what kind of framework of learning it is, but later I found out that this is a framework of learning called reinforcement learning. So actually, as I presented, Sutton, Bartow, Anderson was the very historical paper in the middle of the 80s, which proposed the so-called actor-critic learning architecture. So in this actor-critic architecture, so this is a kind of feedback control system. The example they used is like a cart pole balancing. So this cart moves to keep this pole not falling within this bound of the track. So when if the pole falls down or the cart bumps to the end of the track, we give a negative reward or punishment. So this is a kind of a feedback controller observing the position, velocity of the cart, and also the angular velocity of the pole, and then make a feedback control for the force to the cart. Right? So the naive learning algorithm could be to associate the setting of this parameter with the reward or punishment feedback. But a very important proposal, idea by the Barto and colleagues is that in addition to this controller, which they call the adaptive search element, they created another component called adaptive critic element. So the role of this critic is observe the current state and then predict how much reward or punishment the system is going to get. And then give the prediction error signal as a learning signal for this adaptive search element. So they found that compared to just associating the action and the reward, action and the reward prediction error makes a much better learning. So that is the start of the modern reinforced learning, which is now called the temporal difference learning. Okay. So in reinforcement learning, we repeat three main computation. One is the prediction of a future reward from a current state or current state by taking certain action. So this V of S is called a state value function. So this is the expectation of the immediate reward, reward 1 step later, 2 steps later, and so on. And here, gamma is called a temporal discounting factor, controlling how long into the future you take into account. So if gamma is 0, you just focus on the immediate outcome. As gamma goes close to 1, you take into account the longer delayed outcome. And then in action value function, so you take a particular action A for a given state, and then follow the current policy. And such a prediction of future reward can be used for guiding your action. So the simplest way is called greedy action selection. Using this action value function for a current state, look for an action which maximizes the expected future reward. So this is fine if your learning of the action value function is perfect. But in early stage, you want to do stochastic search. So in that case, the popular way is so-called Boltzmann action selection. So you take action value function as a kind of a negative energy. So you find the action with the higher action value with a higher probability. So this beta is called the inverse temperature parameter. So if beta is 0, you take all the actions with equal probabilities. As the beta becomes larger, the action selection becomes more greedy. And then after predicting the future reward and taking action, what you have to do is learning from the actual experience. Right? So the criterion for learning is called a temporal difference error. So which is a discrepancy between the long-term reward you predicted before taking action and the reward you acquired after taking action, and then the future reward you further predict from the next state, discounting by gamma. Right? And thanks to this exponential discounting, so you have a recursive relationship that previous reward prediction should be the same as the immediate rewards, but as the future reward discounted by gamma. So if your prediction is perfect, these three terms should cancel out to be 0, right? And otherwise, you may learn from such a prediction error to improve your prediction. So here, alpha is the learning rate parameter. You update the previous estimate of the state value or action value in proportion to such a TD error. Right? So this is a kind of a very basic type of reinforcement learning. And then the how to implement these steps more accurately and efficiently is a very important issue in the implementation of reinforcement learning. And also the tuning these parameters like temporal discounting or inverse temperature or learning rate also very important. So the different environment or this different task has different features. So just fixing one parameter may not work well. How to tune these parameters as needed is also an important topic. So in many cases, the engineers like hand tune these parameters, but that is have a limitation. So how to make those settings more autonomous is a very important topic. For example, in the under topic of auto ML. Right? And while these are very important topics in machine learning, I think these are very also important topic in neuroscience. Right? So our brain may not be using exactly the same equations as these, but the prediction of a future reward or according selection to action and the learning from the actual experience would be something that should be happening in our brain. And then because our brain can adapt to many different environments and can learn many different tasks, probably some kind of autonomous tuning mechanisms should exist in our brain. And how that can be made possible, that is a very important topic in neuroscience. And if you have a good answer, maybe that can be applied to like the reinforcement learning of artificial agents. So yeah, so that is the kind of a research theme in my lab. Right. Okay, so we have been using this reinforcement learning framework in many different topics. So this is my favorite toy problem of like a pendulum swing up. Right? So if the motor has a very strong torque, you can pull up the pendulum in one shot. But if the torque is limited, you have to utilize the momentum to pull up the pendulum. So the state space of this system is a two-dimension, angle and angular velocity. So this is a kind of a online learning of the state value function. Right? So white part has a higher value function. Right? So and then by the experience, the agent learns kind of landscape of the value function. There's a kind of a ridge leading to the top stationary point, right? And the policy is learned to follow this ridge toward that peak of the value function, right? Yeah, so this is a kind of a early phase of my work, but many people apply the formulate the reinforcement learning in terms of a discrete state and the discrete action and discrete time. But in applying the reinforcement learning to robots, being able to deal with continuous state, continuous action, and continuous time would be helpful. So that is just the implementation of such a continuous version. And we also applied such algorithm for like physical robots as well. So this is the robot that learns to stand up. So this has a gyro sensor, so it can detect whether it is lying down or standing up. And then the value function is based on the 6-dimensional state variable, like angle of the gyro sensor and the 2 joint and the angular velocities. Right? And then we gave a reward function based on the height of the head of the floor. And when it fell down, we gave a negative reward or punishment. And after many hundreds of bumps and falls, the robot could learn this kind of behavior to stand up. Right? So an important point is that initially the robot keeps the head on the floor. So at this moment, reward is still 0. But by pushing up the weight on the foot, robot can stand up easily, right? So this is one example of a kind of delayed reward problem, right? So one important feature of reinforcement learning is that it can solve the delayed reward problem using the value function, which predicts the future reward. And by doing this kind of hardware experiments, while the robots are learning, we learn a lot how to let the robots learn, right? And for example, the setting of the reward function is very critical. So we say the positive for the head height and the negative for the bumping. And what should be the balance between the two, right? So for example, if you make the punishment for the falling down very strong, the robot may just learn to lie down to avoid any punishment. So that's not what you want. And also, some of the parameters of reinforcement learning, for example, temporal discounting is very important. So if that temporal discount parameter is too small, the robot may find like a quick, easy solution. For example, just sitting up the upper body and then get some kind of small reward rather than a big reward by completely stand up. So that kind of working with the real hardware motivates us kind of a new experiments and the new theoretical developments. Okay. Yeah, and the recent breakthrough in AI and reinforcement learning came from the successful combination of deep neural network and temporal difference learning. So, but in the early, early 90s, the combination of a shallow neural network and then TD learning made a good success in a form called TD gammon. This is a game of the backgammon. The Jerry Tesauro at IBM created a backgammon playing neural network, which was comparable to the top players at that time. So, but soon later, there were some kind of a warning was raised. So in some cases, the combination of the deep neural network and TD learning cause a very undesired effect. Right? And in the TD learning, the learning is based on this prediction error signal, which is a difference between the prediction of future reward in the previous state and the reward acquired and the value function in the next state. But in a realistic transition in the continuous world, this previous state and the new state has a very high correlation. And then when you introduce like a functional approximator, there is some kind of a generalization over the space. So if you try to tune the value function in the previous state, that can also affect your target value as well. So this kind of interaction between the two value functions in this TD error signal can be a source of instability. So for about nearly 2 decades since this discovery, so people try to avoid combining TD learning and multi-layer perceptrons. But yeah, so the breakthrough was given by the people in DeepMind. So this was a quite epoch-making paper, which showed that by combining, by using the TD learning with the like a convolutional neural network to find out the features in this kind of a game screen, you can actually create a human-level game player. Right? So then, in doing that, they made a very important development to make a combination of TD learning and reinforcement, TD learning and deep learning compatible. So one trick they found is a kind of experience replay. So instead of updating the value function as an actual experience, which can cause a problem with the correlation of the input. So store the experience in a buffer, and then later sample randomly from the buffer for the value function update. So actually, the president of the DeepMind, the Demis Hassabis, was in the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit before starting the company. And his research topic there was the function of the hippocampus. So as you know, hippocampus is known to the praise for like episodic memory. So his kind of experience in neuroscience was one source of a successful combination of reinforcement learning and deep learning. And another important contribution was use of two separate networks. So instead of using the same network for the previous value function and the value function in next state, prepare two copies of a network, and then fix the target network, and then only update the one of the network, and then only update the target network in an intermittent way. So that is another trick to make the learning stable, although it is a bit data demanding, right, compared to online learning. So, but this discovery of combining the TD learning and deep learning was the major breakthrough leading to today's success in AI, and partly motivated by the knowledge from neuroscience. Okay, so that is kind of a more like an artificial side, and then also we are interested in how the reinforcement learning is implemented in the brain. So as I briefly presented before, so many people, including ourselves, think that the part of the deep part of the brain called the basal ganglia play an important role in reinforcement learning in the brain. Right? So this if you say brain, many people think of that like a cerebral cortex, and then wrapped around the cerebral cortex, there's a structure called the basal ganglia. So the input site is called the striatum, which is a kind of a looks like this, and then it has several stages of nuclei called globular spiders, and its output go through the thalamus and go back to the cortex. And the important feature of the basal ganglia is this input site called the striatum receive a very strong dopaminergic input from the deep part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And then this is the famous experiments by Wolfram Schultz I just briefly presented. Right? So they implanted the electrode by the anesthesia and the surgery to the monkey brain and monitor the spikes of the dopamine neurons in the brain. Right? So this is called the raster plot. This is a kind of a different trials vertically and the time. Right? So and then when they presented like juice reward without any previous cue, so these dopamine neurons responded. So these are the kind of individual spikes, and this is kind of an average spike frequency. And but in the experiment, when there's a visual cue is presented, and then after 1 second, the juice reward is presented. So interestingly, these neurons started to respond to the visual cue, conditioning stimulus, and stopped to respond to the reward itself. And then in some trials, they didn't provide a reward. In that case, the dopamine activity was suppressed. So this is a very interesting finding on its own. But if you know the theory of temporal difference learning, it is a very, very astonishing finding. So because this is what we expect for the TDA error signal to behave. So before learning, so this value function should be 0. So then you have an equation like a delta equal R. So before learning or when the cue is presented without any notice, this reward would positive reward give like a positive response to this temporal difference error. So, but when cue is presented, the agent can predict the forthcoming reward. So the state value function should step up. And when the reward is acquired, this itself is a positive, but there's not going to be like a reward anymore in the near future. So the state value function should step down. So this, So this step up will cause like a positive response because of temporal differentiation. So here for simplicity, I'm assuming gamma to be 1. And at the time of reward acquisition, the reward itself is positive, but this step down of the value function causes a negative component. So they cancel out and no net response. And then when the predicted reward is not actually given, so this disappointment gives like a step down of the value function and which is causing a negative response. So from this observation, the theoreticians like Andy Bartow, the Peter Dayan, and Reed Montague started to suggest that dopamine takes a very important role in reinforcement learning in the brain. And furthermore, like the dopamine has a function of guiding learning in the brain, especially the input site of the basal ganglia called the striatum. So the neurons in the striatum has so-called synaptic spines, this kind of a protrusion from the dendrite. And then the axons from the cerebral cortex make a synapse to the head of the spine. And in addition, there are like a dopaminergic projection shown in green here. And many of them are kind of attached to the side of this synaptic spine. So this suggests the kind of some kind of like a control of the learning. So then the people, including the Jeff Wickens, started to analyze the synaptic plasticity of this corticostriatal synapse, right? So the common way of synaptic plasticity is a so-called Hebbian learning. If the presynaptic input comes and the postsynaptic neuron responds, this synapse is strengthened. But surprisingly, what they found was the opposite. When they stimulated the cortical fiber and also activated the striatal neurons, this synapse became weaker. But when they also stimulated this dopamine fiber, this synapse became stronger. So there seems to be a kind of 3 times learning rule, input times output times reward signal conveyed by the dopamine fibers. So this suggests that this can be a very important building block for implementing reinforcement learning. And then more recently, the people in University of Tokyo perform a precise measurement of the synaptic plasticity. using light. So while they use a method called glutamate uncaging. So the glutamate is a kind of amino acid and then neurotransmitter used for the cortex to activate the striatal neurons. And then you can chemically create the inactive form of the glutamate, and which is activated by light. And they shine a light to mimic the cortical input, and then use also the light in different frequency to stimulate the dopaminergic terminal. And then also you can control the response of the postsynaptic neuron by sticking an electrode to that. And then what they found that if you give this dopamine feedback within about 1 second of the cortical input and postsynaptic response, the synapse is kind of enlarged to increase the connection. Right. So this like a dopamine-dependent synaptic plasticity is another important components of reinforcement learning in the brain. So yeah, so based on these findings, so many people, including ourselves, proposed the kind of a model of reinforcement learning in the circuit of the basal ganglia. Right. So the cortex and the basal ganglia has a kind of loop circuit through the thalamus. Right. So and the cortex has many neurons representing a sensory state and motor action. So and they project to the striatum, and then some of the neurons in the striatum project to the dopamine neurons, and probably they would be used for computational temporal difference error by the dopamine neurons, and it will come back to the striatum to guide the plasticity. And some other neurons of the striatum project to the structure called the pallidum, and through thalamus and back to the cortex. So our speculation is that these neurons would encode like an action value function, evaluating the goodness of different action candidates. And then through like a dynamic competition, some of the action is selected for actual execution. Yeah. And then that kind of a model motivates the further neuroscience experiments. So then I could had a collaboration with Professor Minoru Kimura, who was at Osaka University at that time. And then we started a joint project of addressing the information coding of the neurons in the striatum. So I sent one of my postdoc at that time, Kazuyuki Samejima, to Kimura Lab to learn the monkey neurophysiology experiments and then do the experiment. So initially we thought of very fancy experiments, but we ended up with doing a very simple task. So the monkey holds the lever and turn it to the left or right. And depending on his action, that he gets a large amount of water or a minimal amount of water. And then we changed the reward probability for the left to right between like a 10%, 50%, 90%. And then actually animal changed the preference for the turning left or turning right based on the experience of the action and the reward feedback. And then by comparing the neuron response for the change in the reward probability for the left lever or the reward probability for the right lever. So we could show that there are some neurons tuning to the reward probability for the left lever and tuned to the reward prediction for the right lever. So they can be, they would be involved in the computation action value for the turning the lever to the left or the turning lever to the right. And then also, while doing this kind of experiment, we developed a new method for analyzing a neural activity. So we assume that the brain's representation of a state value function or action value function change over time. And then what we can observe is the sensory motor signal. What kind of stimuli we gave, what kind of action they made, and what kind of reward we gave. So this is a kind of hidden state inference program. So and then we considered the reinforcement learning algorithm a kind of Bayesian network. So then the hidden variables are like action values and then parameters of reinforcement learning. And then the learning rule defines how this action value function changes over time. And then what we can observe is like a sensory motor reward variable. And we can observe the action according to the action policy. And so then based on this state transition model and observation model, we can run like a dynamic Bayesian inference. So given the sequence of the state action reward, what could be the time course, hidden time course of the action value function, and also the parameters. So yeah, so this is an example using a particle filtering. Blue, yeah, so this is the actual choice of the animal. Blue for the left and red for the right. And the long bar is a rewarded trial, and the short bar is an unrewarded trial. So, and then we prepare many reinforcement learning agents or virtual rats with a different setting or parameters. And then each of them update the action value function based on the experience, same of the real animal. And then predict the probability of the next choice. And then we keep those agents which predicts the animal's next action well, and then eliminate the bad ones. And then we can estimate the parameters and the associated time course of action values over time. So previously, we performed like a block-wise analysis of a neural response, but using this framework, we can keep track of the dynamic change of the variables of our interest and some kind of neural correlates. So we applied such a method to the more recent experiments in rats. So in this experiment, rat put his nose to the center hole and go left or right. And depending on his choice, he's giving a food pellet with like a 10%, 50%, and 90%. And such a setting of the reward is changed once in a while. And this is the time course of the left action value over about 200 trials estimated by such a particle filter. And this kind of information is helpful, like a fingerprint, to look for interesting suspects in the brain. And by systematic regression analysis, my former postdoc Makoto found that some neurons have a very highly correlated activity change over trials, similar to this action value function estimated from the behavior. So this neuron changed activity when the animal put his nose in the center hole and listened to the sound cue. And then we also found some kind of a difference in the different parts of the stratum. So those media are part of the stratum. So had the largest proportion of action values. The other part had more representation movements. Other parts had a more representation like state value. So this suggests some kind of a hierarchical organization in the cortical basal ganglia circuit. So so this is the kind of a way how we can combine machine learning methods for the analysis of behavior and neural activity of the brain. So and I think the interaction between the machine learning and neuroscience in by two directions, right? So and two different ways. So one is that like a machine learning framework, like a theoretical framework, like a reinforcement learning or Bayesian inference, can be a model about how the brain might be functioning. And also such a machine learning framework can be helpful for analyzing the behavior data and also neural recording data. So today it is important for neuroscientists to have a sufficient knowledge of machine learning. And that's why we hold a course like a computational neuroscience course here. Okay, yeah. So one limitation of the conventional electoral recording is that we don't know what type of neurons we are recording from. So for example, in our model, we assume that in the stratum, there are at least two types of neurons which are representing state value and projecting the dopamine neurons, and action value projecting the paradigm and then involved in action selection. So, but more recently, using technology from molecular biology, you can perform like a cell-specific recording. So this is a more recent work my former student Tomohiko performed. So instead of a wire electrode, we implanted glass endoscope of about 0.5 millimeter diameter, and then observed the activity of neurons. So these neurons are shown in green, the neurons that are projecting to the dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra. And then we could perform like a selective recording of a particular type of neurons in the brain. And what we found is that when we associate the certain order cue, like a order of a lemon or some kind of a fruits with a reward, as soon as the cue is presented, before the reward is actually presented, these neurons start activating. Right? So this study showed that there are indeed neurons in the stratum that projects the dopamine neurons, which are involved in reward prediction. So we are now trying to record from the neurons projecting the thalamus to see if they are representing like an action value function. Since that discovery of the Wolfram shoots, a lot of work has been done for the neural implementation of reinforcement learning. But still, there are many open questions. So it was reported that dopamine neurons has like a temporal difference error like response. But how that kind of response is shaped in the neural circuit around the substantia nigra is still not completely understood. And another question is that the circuit of the basal ganglia is quite complex. So my previous diagram is a quite a simplified version. So there's a so-called direct pathway and the indirect pathway, and also hyper-direct pathway. So why this kind of multiple parallel pathways are necessary? That is a quite interesting question. So if you just use a very simple minded, if you just implement very simple reinforced learning, just action value or state value is fine. But as we try to make algorithms more robust and efficient, we tend to make the network more elaborate. For example, the soft actor critic is one of the common popular reinforcement learning algorithm developed more recently. So one interesting feature of a soft actor critic is the state value function, action value function, and the policy functions learned simultaneously. So if you write it in a kind of a circuit diagram, it will see a kind of a complex network like this. So yeah, I haven't figured out whether this kind of architecture can really map to the network of the basal ganglia. But yeah, so probably some discovery in the brain, discovery in the brain may suggest the new architecture in the AI, or on the other hand, the new development in the AI may give us a hint about how to interpret the complex network of the brain. So yeah, so that is something I'm hoping to do. Okay, so now it is coming close to the 10:30, so I will stop here and then want to take questions. Okay, so I hope people are coming back from the coffee. So in the first part, I mainly talked about like a very basic reinforcement learning, how that could be possibly realized in the brain. And then I will step more into like a topic about data efficiency. So the basic algorithm I presented in the first part is a so-called model-free reinforcement learning. And there's also a type of reinforcement learning called the model-based, right? So in the model-free reinforcement learning, for example, we memorize the action value for all the possible state action pairs, and then implement the policy based on that, for example, using a Boltzmann action selection, and then learn from the experience, for example, using like a temporal difference error. So this is very simple. If you write in Python, it can be just a few lines of code. But this simple method tends to be rather slow in learning. You need a lot of experience of different states and reward, states and action reward. Right? So in a model-based framework, so agents learn the internal model of the action-dependent state transition and also the reward function. Right? So and then if you have such a model, so you can estimate the current state. Sorry, it is kind of divided into two lines based on like a dynamic Bayesian inference. So using some kind of a noisy or delayed observation of the state. Right? So and also using such action state transition model, you can compute the action value function or a state value function. And rather than before actually trying using such a state transition model and then using a state value function, you estimate the action value function. And model-based reinforcement learning can allow a more flexible adaptation from relatively fewer experience, but the internal computation can be quite heavy. Right? So this is my favorite example of a model-based reinforcement learning, which was done by Pablo somewhere in the room when he was a student in my lab. Right. So this is a robot made of a smartphone. It tried to like bounce up and balance. Right. So and initially it makes some kind of almost random movements. But while doing that, this robot gathered the data about how the body responds to the wheel movement. We used like an internal accelerometer of the robot to measure that, right? And then build a model of the robot dynamics, particularly using like a Gaussian process model. And then use offline optimization based on the learned model to improve the policy. And then with this framework, the robot could acquire the behavior to, okay, yeah. Yeah, like this. So this is a kind of one demonstration of the data efficiency of the model-based approach. Right. So because of this like a trade-off between the data efficiency and the internal computation, so which of them, like model-free and model-based, we should use? And also the success of the model-based approach depends on the accuracy of the internal model. So how to select or combine between the model-free and model-based approach is a very important topic in reinforcement learning. And then we suspect that maybe the brain would be doing some kind of model-based approach, right? So and then when the brain takes like a model-based approach, we may call it a kind of a mental simulation, right? So we can define the mental simulation as the brain processing using action-dependent state transition model, either deterministic or like a probabilistic. So if you have such an internal model, you can estimate the present state based on the past state and action, even when the immediate perception is noisy or delayed or occluded. And you can use such a state transition model to plan ahead the sequence of actions to reach to the desired state for the model-based decision or action planning. And you can apply such a model to arbitrarily assumed state for kind of a thought experiment. And such a mechanism for kind of imagination is very important for human cognition. For example, our use of language is based on our ability to imagine the situation based on the language input. Right? And also, if you produce a theory of science, you have to do a lot of thought experiments before actually moving on to a physical experiments. Right? So I think this mechanism of mental simulation is a very important target of neuroscience, which has been like understudied so far. Right? So it can be used from like a basic sensory motor control to the like a higher level cognitive functions. Right? So, but how our brain's network can actually allow something like learning and the use of such an internal model, that is still a kind of an open question. Yeah, and this mechanism of mental simulation would be linked to the our phenomenon of consciousness. But if you try to do like a neuroscience of consciousness, you have to argue about what is consciousness over many years. So, but if you define the mental simulation as a process using action-dependent state transition model, you can show that its use in more rigorously from the behavior and also analyze its neural correlates in a more practical way. So that's why I choose the framework of mental simulation for our research program. Right. So, and then in thinking of such implementation of the mental simulation or model-based processing, so probably the distinction of different parts of the brain would be important. So this is a kind of a very approximate caricature of what kind of learning implemented in the different parts of the brain, right? So the cerebellum is a kind of relatively old part of the brain, and then its learning is known to be controlled by so-called climbing fiber from the inferior olive. Right? So those climbing fiber has a kind of each output neuron in the cerebellum has only one climbing fiber input, whereas it has many so-called parallel fiber input. So from such anatomical architecture, so early theoreticians like David Ma and Albus proposed that maybe this climbing fiber provides some kind of a teaching signal for the cerebral output neurons. And then in the later analysis showed that these climbing fiber input encodes the error in the motor performance or sensory prediction. And also it has been shown that the plasticity in the cerebellum is guided by this climbing fiber input. So then the major hypothesis is that the cerebellum is used as a kind of like a perceptron-like learning machinery, which use the discrepancy between the target and its output, and then using the error to run the appropriate input-output mapping. And another major part of the brain is the basal ganglia, so underneath the cerebral cortex. As I presented in the first part, so the basal ganglia may be involved in reinforcement learning based on the reward or reward prediction error signal encoded by dopamine neurons. And cerebral cortex has many different representations of the sensory state, like a vision, or audition, or tactile information, and also many different information about motion and action plan, right? And then the cerebral cortex may not have a specific learning signal, but this has been shown, especially in the visual cortex, that feature tuning of those neurons based on the sensory experience. So that is a framework of unsupervised learning. And also the cerebral cortex has a lot of recurrent connection that can be used for working memory maintenance, and in some cases like a Bayesian inference. Right? So and then such a different machinery for the supervised learning and the reinforcement learning, and then unsupervised learning, unsupervised representation learning, and working memory might be utilized for like implementation of model-based processing. So, and one possibility we considered is like model-based action selection. Right? So, in the model-free case, you just look for the action which maximizes the action value function. So that may be utilized by linking the state and action representation in the cortex and action value function in the basal ganglia. So model-based strategy is a little bit complex. So you have to predict the future state. And then depending on the goodness of the predicted state, you take an action. So the simple version of such a model-based action selection may be realized by like a network like this. So the cerebellum would have learned the deterministic action dependent state transition, using so-called like a forward model based on the past experience. And then if some part of the brain come up with a like action candidate, the resulting state is predicted. And then the goodness of such a predicted state is evaluated by the state value function. And if it is good enough, you execute the action, and otherwise you look for another action candidate. So this is a rather complex dynamics. But once you find out that this is a good action to take in a certain given state, so you don't need to repeat the same computation again and again. You just memorize this state to action mapping. So that is a kind of another form of supervised learning. So maybe some other part of the brain may be involved in some kind of a habitual state to action mapping. Right? So that was our kind of expectation. And then to test such a possibility, we designed brain imaging experiment with a human subject with like a functional MRI. So in a functional MRI, MRI is originally used for observing the shape of the brain, anatomy of the brain. But by tuning the parameter of the scanner, we can detect the change in the blood flow. Right? So then we can measure which part of the brain is more active in a certain state. So in this experiment, we developed like a simple computer game. So to move this cursor from the starting position to the goal position. But to make this game interesting, we limited the movement of the cursor to only 3 directions. So by pressing with one of the 3 buttons. And then for moving to a certain direction, there's no straightforward path. So you have to find out this kind of a zigzag movement. Right? So we call it like a grid sailing task. So unlike a usual grid maze task, you have to find a zigzag path, which is also common in sailing in upwind. Right. So we asked the subject to practice with this so-called key map, how the cursor moves with the pressing of the key, which is a kind of action-dependent state transition model. So finding this kind of path is not easy just by random trial and error. But once you have this kind of action-dependent state transition model, you can quite efficiently find this path. Right? And then after pre-practice with the key map, we ask the subject to perform this game within the MRI scanner. And then after showing this goal position, we ask the subject to not move the finger for the first like 4 to 6 seconds. But if they have a internal action-dependent state transition model, they can mentally plan what is the right path and what is the right sequence of key phrase to realize that. And indeed, we found that subject performance improved by giving this pre-movement like thinking time. Right? So that is a kind of behavioral evidence for the like mental simulation. And then we asked how the brain of those subjects are working by analyzing the brain activity during this pre-movement delay time. And what we found is that in the cerebral cortex areas like parietal cortex, which is known to be involved in spatial processing, and premotor cortex, which is known to be involved in action sequence, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is known to be involved in spatial working memory activated. But in addition to that, we found elevated activity in the particular part of the cerebellum and the particular part of the basal ganglia connected to these cortical areas. So our interpretation is that cerebellum is used for the result of imagining the action, and such predicted state is represented in the cortex using its capability of working memory. And then the basal ganglia would be used for evaluate the goodness of such action, and then that is utilized when the go signal is presented to the subject. So and the result suggests that so for the implementation of the mental simulation, some kind of a global network of the brain combining the cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and the basal ganglia, specialized for different kinds of learning, would be involved. And in addition to these global aspect, we are also interested in how the mental simulation is implemented in the local circuit, for example, in the parietal cortex. And to do that, we started another collaboration with Professor Bernd Kuhn at OIST, who is an expert in optical neural imaging. So we used a kind of machinery called two-photon imaging. So this is a microscope that uses infrared light so that it can monitor the activities of neurons about up to like 0.5 millimeter from the surface of the cortex. So we performed the surgery to remove part of the skull and replace that with glass. And then through the glass, we measure the activity of neurons. To measure activity of neurons, we use a molecular technique so that calcium sensitive fluorescent molecules are expressed, produced in the cortical neurons. And then using this setup, we can monitor the neural activities. Yeah. So now my computer is a bit slowing down, but yeah. So we can monitor the activity of neurons while the mouse is engaged in the task. Right? So for this experiment, we designed a kind of a auditory virtual environment. So and under the darkness, the mouse locomote to the target with the head fixed under the microscope on the air floated ball. And then we measure the rotation with this ball and change the auditory feedback to approximate approaching to the target. And when the target animal reaches to the target, the sugar water reward is given. So the situation is similar to this popular beach game. So you cannot see the target, but using the sporadic sound feedback and also based on how many steps you have made, you can estimate the position of the target and then get the reward if successful. So and then the in this experiment, so we performed like a Bayesian inference, Bayesian decoding method to this activity of neurons. Right. So first we identify the distance tuning of different neurons. So some neurons are activated in a certain distance to the target, some neurons have a kind of a ramping activity toward the target. And from the instantaneous activity of neurons, by combining the cyclic function and the flat prior, we can estimate the posterior distribution of the goal distance based on the activity of neurons. And then as the mouse goes close to the target, neural activities change. And then in this environment, sometimes we turn off the sound feedback, where the immediate sensory information cannot be used. But if the mouse has an internal model to update the distance based on his own locomotion, he should be able to estimate the distance. And indeed, this neural representation of the distance was updated closer to the actual distance, although the uncertainty was increased. And when the mouse, this sound feedback is turned on again, so the uncertainty was decreased. So this is something similar to the behavior of a dynamic Bayesian inference. So using a state transition model to update, estimate the current state, and use the observation model to make the estimate more accurate. So and then we think that this parietal cortex is a part of the brain network that implements a very basic form of a mental simulation about where the target is in the environment. Okay. So this is just a kind of a beginning of our experiment. So we found such an existence of a correlate of a mental simulation, but how such an update is realized in the cortex network of the brain, that is something we are addressing right now. Yeah. Okay. So in this these two experiments, we first use the internal model for action planning, and in this experiment, we use the internal model for the state inference. Right? So state inference and then the motor control is often used together. So using a model to resolve the uncertainty, and also using a model to plan appropriate action is something quite commonly done in practice. And actually, so when the Rudolf Kaumann invented so-called Kalman filter for estimating the state of the system with a kind of noisy observation. So here he realized that the equation used for this optimal filtering is very similar to the equation used for optimal control, which was developed by the Richard Bellman several years ago. Right? So these are both Riccati equation using the state dynamics, state transition matrix A, and also the observation metrics, and then assumption about the noise variance. Right? And then in the optimal control side, this A is the system dynamics, and other terms are related to the setting of the reward function. Right? So this similarity of optimal filtering of optimal control was known as the duality of inference control. And then if you open a textbook of optimal control, you always found this kind of knowledge. So this was long been known as a beauty of control theory. But recently, theoreticians like Emo Todorov and then Toysand realized that there may be a more important, meaningful relationship. Right? So basically what was observed is that the computation of the posterior function in the Bayesian inference is very similar to the computation of the state value function in the reinforcement learning optimal control, right? And then this correspondence of Bayesian inference and reinforcement learning has a very practical meaning. For example, if you have a different algorithm in the Bayesian inference, you can come up with a reinforcement learning version of such an algorithm. For example, the soft after critic I introduced was produced using such a mapping. And Sergey Levin recently wrote a tutorial about how the kind of message passing like a framework is implemented in for the purpose of optimal control and reinforcement learning. So in such a framework, we assume like an optimality variable, which has a 1 for optimal performance, and then the reward is defined as like a log probability of this optimality function. So this correspondence between Bayesian inference and reinforcement learning is practically very important. But I think this is also important for neuroscience as well. Because in our brain, the posterior half is mostly used for sensory processing, like a visual cortex, auditory cortex, or sonosensory cortex. And the frontal half of the brain, cortex, is used for action, like a motor control, or like a frontal cortex for higher level action planning. But the cerebral cortex has a common 6-layer organization, even though the thickness of different layers are different across different brain areas, right? So then if the sensory processing and motor processing are totally different things, there's no way you can use the same architecture. But the use of a similar architecture suggests that the use of like a similar kind of algorithm for sensory inference and motor control. So, and especially for the side of sensory processing, many people have already proposed how the dynamic Bayesian inference might be implemented in the circuit of the cortex, right? And then if you believe in the like a duality or correspondence between the Bayesian inference and the reinforcement learning, you can think of like candidates of roles of different types of neurons in the cerebral cortex, right? So that is a kind of, I think, like, interesting possibility to further test. So we came up with some kind of a hypothesis that how the different layers of neurons in different layers specialize in the different computation in the Bayesian inference and reinforcement learning. So yeah, so in this case, a model-based reinforcement learning or optimal control, right? And then to address that issue, so we started a new kind of experiment. So in the previous two-photon imaging, we recorded the activities of neurons like a layer by layer. This is a so-called prism lens. So it is a bit invasive. You have to stick a tip of the glass, stick a prism into the cortex about like 1 millimeter width, and then observe the neurons from the sideways with the superficial layer and the deep layer simultaneously. And then we let the mouse, train the mouse to pull the lever and then observe the activities of the somatosensory neuron. And then my student Sergey developed a paradigm so that the resistance to the lever can be heavy or light. And then there's in some session, this is mostly light, but sometimes heavy. And in other session, this is mostly heavy, but sometimes light. So we are interested in how some expected sensory feedback and unexpected sensory feedback would affect the neural responses. Right? So and we could compare the activities of the superficial neurons and the deep layer neurons. Just by checking by eye, the difference is not so obvious. But by kind of a regression analysis of tuning of these neurons, Sergey found that larger proportion of deep layer neurons encode expected trial type if it is heavy or light. And then larger proportion of the neurons in the superficial layer showing green have a representation actual trial type. So such a difference was observed. And we also performed like a population decoding. So from that population activity of neuron, whether we can decode whether this is the heavy trial or like a light resistance trial. Yeah, and we found that deep layer neurons have a better encoding of like expected type of trial during the session. Right. So this is a kind of a one step ahead for understanding in more detail the mechanism of the like sensory processing based on the prediction and the actual outcome. So we are further analyzing whether this kind of a picture fits the hypothesis that sensory cortical circuit perform like a Bayesian inference. And now new PhD student Naohiro is following up in this paradigm to address the activities of the neurons in the primary motor cortex and how they represent the variables related to reinforcement learning. So hope we can have a better understanding of the implementation of the Bayesian inference and reinforcement learning, or more model-based reinforcement learning, or more widely like mental simulation in the cortical circuit. So, and today's computers are very good at running simulations once the dynamic equations are written down, right? So, but our brain seems to have the capability of learning like appropriate model. Initially, a very coarse, rough model, and then with the like online and active experience, gradually fine-tune the model and then allow more fine sensory judgment and more fine motor control. And how such like online adaptive acquisition and the use of the internal model realized in the brain, that is still a big question. And if we understand that, hopefully we can make artificial intelligence, which is more data efficient and incrementally become capable as it gets more experience. So that is the kind of a topic we hope to work on in parallel regarding the implementation of model-based processing in the brain, and then like online model-based processing in artificial agents. Okay. So this use of a model is probably one important component, but there are many other questions For example, in my functional MRI experiment, I showed that different parts of the brain are activated for the model-based processing, action planning. And then the brain is supposed to be organized with like a collection of many experts. Some circuit specialized for visual processing, some circuits for specialized in auditory processing, and some circuit for action planning, and so on. And then they seems to be activated as necessary. And then that is a kind of a baseline assumption in all most of the functional MRI study. So and even if we show the similar sensory stimulus, based on the task demand, different parts of the brain become activated. From that, we estimate that the brain's computational architecture. But we still don't know exactly how such appropriate activation and then appropriate connection is made possible, right? Yeah, and such like a modularity or hierarchical processing is very important for model-based data-efficient learning. For example, I showed this example of a robot that learns to stand up, but what we actually implemented is a kind of a hierarchical reinforcement learning, right? So the upper level, the agent search for like a discrete sequence of postures. And then in the lower level, the different controllers realize the different target postures. So, and with the simultaneous learning of the lower level and the higher level, we could realize such learning with a physical robot in a realistic learning time. So then in this example, this kind of hierarchical structure was hand-coded by us. But the brain seems to have mechanisms to appropriately select and the right module and connect them. So how such appropriate combination of different modules is still a kind of an interesting open question. So Daniel Woppert and Mitsuo Kawato proposed like a so-called mosaic architecture, which uses the prediction error signal to select the right module, which is consistent with the current environmental situation. So we kind of extended it to a reinforcement learning framework to use the Bellman error, the error in the inconsistency in the value function computation for the right combination of the value function, reward function, and the state transition function. So there are some other proposals about the combination of different combination selection of different modules. Right? And then also the how such activation and selection and combination of realized in the brain biophysically is also a very interesting topic. Right? So for example, the basal ganglia has been suggested to be involved in action selection, but it may happen in a more like a macroscopic level. Rather than concrete action, the selection of a certain strategy or a certain module. And then in addition to such a selection mechanism, some kind of a dynamic recurrent connection to settle into certain attractor might be another mechanism. And on the biophysical level, the Zhaojin Wan and Robert Young proposed like a different gating in the cortical circuit. In the cerebral cortex, there are different types of inhibitory neurons. Some of them are targeting the input site of the cortical circuit. Others are targeting the output site of the cortex, cortical neurons. So they may be used for gating of the input signal or gating of the output signal, right? So this is still an open question, and then I hope to find out the like a computationally efficient and also biologically realistic mechanism. Right? So and also recently in the deep learning, the transformer architecture made a very big success. So compared to previous architectures, transformer using some kind of attention mechanism turned out to scale well for a very large scale heterogeneous data set. Right? So probably such a success of a transformer may have something to do with the flexible learning in the brain. So the so-called attention in the transformer literature may not be the same as the attention in the psychology meaning, but some kind of internal gating using query and the key mechanism may have some similarity with the large-scale modular organization of the brain. So that is a kind of a topic I want to learn more, hopefully during this summer school. Right. Okay, so we talked about the use of internal model and then the modular architecture. But another important topic is learning to learn or kind of meta learning. Right? So there are different topics of meta learning. So like a transfer learning can be considered as one of them. So based on the previous learning, you can learn a new task in a more efficient way. Another domain of meta learning is the right setting of these parameters, like a temporal discounting or like a exploration or learning rate. So in reinforcement learning, this temporal discounting factor is a particularly interesting parameter. Right? So this is a robot which has a camera and they look for a battery pack and then successfully reach to the target to get the reward. And then this robot was initially doing random exploration, but somehow learned to stay still. Yeah. Okay. For some reason, this movie is not moving quite smoothly. Yeah, but unless this battery pack is seen really close, this robot doesn't want to go take it, right? So the reason behind that is like this. So in exponential temporal discounting, gamma square, gamma cube quickly go close to zero if the gamma setting is small, right? So in a situation like you have to spend certain cost to get the reward. So this weighted expectation can be negative. So it's not worth doing. So that was happening to this the robot on the right-hand side, right? So, but this small setting of gamma doesn't always make the agent quiescent. So in a situation when some action is associated with immediate reward, but the big punishment in the future, you cannot resist the temptation. So can result in like impulsive behavior. So this is a very interesting parameter of reinforcement learning, which affect the like a character of a learned behavior. And then in practice, we often spend time tuning this gamma parameter, starting from 0.9 and 0.99 and 0.995 and so on. Right? So because this gamma has to be large enough, but if you make this gamma very close to 1, you have to predict a long future. So that makes learning more difficult. So the gamma has to be large enough, but better not to be too large. And then we, humans and animals, be able to learn different wide variety of tasks. some are just okay with the immediate reward. Some requires a long-term process to get the reward. So probably our brain should have some mechanism to control such a temporal discounting or like a corresponding mechanism. So we started to think what could be such a regulatory mechanism, and then came up with a hypothesis is that brain's transmitter system called serotonin may take a role in the control of temporal discounting. So serotonin and dopamine is one of the neuromodulators. So neuromodulators are one type of subset of neurotransmitters. So while the standard neurotransmitters like glutamate and GABA is used for point-to-point communication, specific to one neuron to the other. But some other neurotransmitters like dopamine, acetylcholine, noradrenaline, and serotonin produce signal from the core of the brain and projected very widely in the brain. And then those transmitters diffuse into the volume. So rather than a detailed point-to-point communication, these neuromodulators are supposed to regulate some kind of a global parameter or global variable. And the dopamine encoding the temporal difference error is one such example. This is a very important, most important learning signal for reinforcement learning. And then based on the literature and also the basic theory of reinforcement learning, we came up with a hypothesis that different neuromodulators may be related to the regulation of different parameters. For example, acetylcholine for the learning rate, the like acquisition of new memory, and noradrenaline for exploration and exploitation, like focusing or relaxing, and the serotonin for temporal discounting. So focusing right now or looking ahead for the long future. Right? So based on such a hypothesis, we perform the experiments mostly focusing on the serotonergic system. So after we started our lab in Okinawa, we started a chemical setup. So this is a method called microdialysis. You can implant microdialysis probe in the brain of the rat and then monitor the chemicals in the brain. And with this machine called HPLC, you can monitor the change of the dopamine and the serotonin concentration in like 5 minutes temporal resolution. Right? So what we found is that the rat goes to the food site, and then in some session, the food plate is given immediately. And in some other session, they have to wait several seconds until the food plate comes off. And in such a delayed reward task, the release of serotonin was increased. And then our lab member Kayoko also performed a pharmacological suppression of serotonin neurons using this same probe. And then when we suppress the release of serotonin, the animals made more errors in waiting for the delayed reward. So this suggests that serotonin has something to do with the acquisition of the delayed reward. And also another lab member in our lab, Katsuhiko Miyazaki, did a neural recording of serotonin neurons. We implanted a bundle of electrodes in the rat's brain, and then we measure the activities of neurons while the animal is going back and forth between the food site and water site. Yeah, so this clicking sound is like a spike of the serotonergic neurons. I'm sorry, this movie is not updating, although the sound is ongoing. Yeah. So what we found is that while the animal is waiting for the forthcoming food or water, this serotonin neuron increase firing until the successful reward acquisition. And for a longer waiting, sometimes the animal abandons to wait. So if you align the neural activity at the time of abandoning, we found that the higher level of serotonin activity stops right before abandoning. So the serotonin may be linked to the keeping the motivation for the delayed reward. And more recently, we can use the method called optogenetics. So in this genetically engineered animal, we can activate the serotonin neuron by shining a blue light. And then using a yellow light, it can stop stimulating the serotonin neurons. So in this experiment, mouse waited for the food pellet after 3 seconds, 6 seconds, 9 seconds, or infinity. So for 9-second waiting, mice often abandons to wait, but such abandoning decreased by blue light stimulation of the serotonin neurons. And for infinity trials, so mouse usually abandons after like 10 seconds, but with the blue light stimulation of the serotonin neurons, they can wait much longer. So this result shows that the serotonin activity of serotonin neurons makes the animal more patient for the delayed reward, or like increase the motivation for increase the evaluation for the delayed reward. So that was consistent with our initial hypothesis. But as we did more experiment, we found that the story is not so simple. So for example, when we omitted the reward in once in 4 trials, this serotonin stimulation took effect. But if we gave a reward only 1/4 of the trials, serotonin stimulation didn't make much difference, even when we increased the reward size to equate the value. So the serotonin stimulation needs the high level of certainty of reward to be effective. And also, when the reward timing is always the same, the effect of serotonin stimulation is minor, but the reward timing is varied, effect of serotonin stimulation much longer for the reward omission trial. So this dependence of occurrence certainty and the timing uncertainty was not very easy to explain from a simple model-free reinforcement learning paradigm. So, and then we came up with like a Bayesian weighting decision model, so that the animal has a kind of internal model of the timing of a reward delivery, and combine that with a prior belief of the reward delivery to decide when to abandon waiting. So basically, if you wait longer and then food pellet doesn't come off, the likelihood of this trial to be unrewarded increase, or likelihood for the rewarded trial decrease. And then this was modulated by the prior belief to produce the posterior and let the animal decide abandoning. And as this likely function is a more internal model is more long-tailed, the effect of manipulation of the prior have a larger effect on waiting time. So we could reproduce the animal's behavior based on this kind of model. So yeah, it was fortunate that with this model, we could get the paper accepted to the Nature Communications. But it also motivated us to alter our hypothesis, extend our hypothesis. For example, we talked about model-free and model-based reinforcement learning. I probably don't have enough time to explain in detail, but in the mouse, you can use this kind of 2-step task to discriminate whether the animal is working on the model-free or model-based paradigm. So we first trained the animals with the state transition. So if the animals choose the left, the next state is up. And if the animal chooses right, next state is mostly down. Right? And then if the animal have such an internal model state transition, they can acquire the reward more efficiently. And then we model the animal behavior based on hybrid model-free, model-based reinforcement learning model. And then through serotonin neuron suppression, we found that model-based component became weaker with when we suppress the serotonin activity. So, and then this let us kind of extend our hypothesis. Yeah, so that the serotonin does not just control the temporal discounting, but depending on how much time available for learning and decision. So different parameters like exploration, or also the choice between model-free and model-based strategy might be affected. So this is a kind of like a working hypothesis, and then we hope to gradually test these kind of hypotheses for better understanding the serotonergic system. And then as we understand the brain's strategy for tuning these parameters, maybe that will be helpful for creating reinforcement learning agents that can more robustly and flexibly adapt to different environments and different tasks. Okay. So and then let's move on to the last topic of autonomy and the sociality. So we suppose that our brain tunes the temporal discounting parameter, but theoretically that is a big problem, right? Because temporal discounting parameter is a part of the objective function. So in the standard machine learning paradigm, you cannot tweak the objective function. Objective function is something that needs to be maximized or minimized. So for the tweak of the temporal discounting, we have to have some kind of higher level objective to allow such a tuning of the parameter. And also we know that the design of the reward function is very important in reinforcement learning. So engineers often take time in designing the right reward function so that the appropriate desired behavior is achieved. So and that kind of a problem led us to create robots like this. So in biological systems, the reward system is linked with a major requirement of life, which is like a self-preservation and then self-reproduction. Right? So for example, like food, water, and avoiding pain may be linked with survival. And then sexual and social reward may be linked with reproduction. Right? So we wanted to make like an artificial system with the same constraint. So this robot captured battery pack and recharges itself for survival. And it has like an infrared communication port. They can copy the program or with the common program and copy the parameters. So that is a kind of software reproduction. And then in such a framework, how can the robots learn to survive and then learn to reproduce? That was our challenge. So after fairly well charged, these robots look for a kind of a mating partner, and then by facing each other, and then using infrared communication, they can copy the parameters for the program. And we implemented the embodied evaluation framework. So each hardware robot has like tens of software agents, and each of them have different parameters or genes. Those parameters encode like a basic behavior network, choice between foraging or mating, and also the parameters for the reward function and the parameters for reinforcement learning. And then when they copy these parameters, the better charged, the more likely that these parameters are used in the next generation. And we also implement random mutation to realize like a distributed evolution of these parameters. And we combine like physical robots and also simulation to accelerate the process. And then, for example, if we look at the evolution with the parameters, so this gray line is the temporal discounting parameter. It was initially like widely distributed. Through evolution, it converges to very close to 1, right? So lambda is like a TD lambda, like eligibility trace parameter. And then together with the evolution reward function, the temperature, the inverse of inverse temperature go close to 0. It required very little exploration. And this is the evolution of the reward function. So in these robots, the acquisition of the battery pack and the successful transfer of the gene are the obvious source of reward. But just by such a final reward, learning a right action is quite difficult. In this robot, based on the camera image, so robot control the 2 motors to approach to either the battery pack or the another robot. Right? So as we have like a reward system like smells or taste, which guide us to a more nutritious object instead of a random eating of anything. So we also gave like a supplementary reward to the robot. The vision of the battery pack in the view and the vision of the face of another robot in the view, right? So initially we set this function randomly, but surviving agents kind of gradually evolve the reward function. And finally, when the battery is seen in the middle of the view and closer to the robot, it has a large reward. So that kind of a shaping reward makes the catching behavior very efficient. So in the case of face of another robot, because this infrared communication is hard to do when they are too close, so more elongated profile visual reward was found. So this is a kind of a demonstration that by combining reinforcement learning with like evolutionary framework, we let the Usher agents to acquire their own reward function and meta parameters for reinforcement learning. Right? And then in doing this kind of experiment, we found some kind of unexpected behaviors. So in this environment, the important decision is whether to spend your time charging or spend your time for mating. So when the robot finds the battery pack and then another robot simultaneously, some robots always go to the charging, and some others like keep track of the another robot and try to perform mating. Right? So and my former postdoc Stefan Elfring found that even in the same colony, sometimes heterogeneous behaviors are found. So he performed the gene analysis of these robots and found that there are actually 2 separate subpopulations within the colony, like foragers and trackers. So foragers start mating only when they are almost fully charged. And the trackers start charging even when they are less than half charged. Right? So in this evolutionary framework, the success of mating depends on the charge level. but also the number of mating matters. So then the two strategies of favoring the success rate or number of mating were kind of combined. And he found that the appropriate mix of the two kinds can realize evolutionary stability. So this is a kind of a demonstration that even heterogeneous surviving strategy can be found by combining reinforcement learning and evolutionary framework. And unfortunately, these robots became too old, and also the company that produced the robot went out of business. So we are now building our own robots using smartphones. So because they have a high performance CPU with lots of sensors and quite affordable, right? So it can go to the charging station for survival. And for the reproduction, you can use like a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, but then we cannot see what's happening. So the method we chose is that the robot can show the genetic code in the QR code, and then by facing each other, they can copy the genetic code, and then either learn the policy or the parameter reward function or parameters for reinforcement learning can be copied to another agent. Right. All right. So, and so far we talked about the evolution of the like a supplementary reward, like visual reward. But my PhD student Yuji Kanagawa is now working on the evolution of all the reward, like acquisition of food, or like a cost for the action, or like touching with other agents and so on, right? Using like a virtual setup. And also survival and reproduction is very basic to any creature, but we just don't live for the food and sex alone, right? So and we have a kind of something like a curiosity, right? So acquisition of new information is a strong motivation, especially in human, but more widely in the different animals. So and such a kind of additional reward mechanism promoting exploration and acquisition of new information is termed kind of intrinsic reward. So there has been a lot of study going on how to implement such an intrinsic reward in a computational way. So putting a supplementary reward for new environment is very basic. And also the different ways of shaping reward is utilized. Just setting a higher temperature for the action choice is a very primitive way of exploration, promoting exploration, but not very target-oriented. And in the model-based framework, like something like novelty of the experience, or like deviation from the current model, or like improvement of the prediction model can be a possible source of internal reward. And then in my lab, another PhD student, Tojo, is working on the possible evolution of different types of intrinsic reward. So he focuses on the 3 types of intrinsic reward based on the novelty. So whether the new observation is rare in terms of the past experience, or the surprise, whether the certain expression is unexpected based on the current prediction model. And also another possible source is so-called empowerment. So how much control you have regarding a future state based on the action you are going to take. So in certain situations, like in a strong current, whatever you do, you end up in the same result. But in certain situations, you can choose to decide, control which to go. So that kind of a degrees of freedom might be a source of another intrinsic reward. So he's now studying in what kind of environment, what kind of intrinsic rewards are like favored. Okay, and then these are the kind of a topic of how to design or evolve the reward function. But there's another line of work for estimating the reward function of a human expert. This is called like inverse reinforcement learning. In the usual reinforcement learning, and then reward function and then environmental dynamics specify the value function, and then optimal policies produced. In the inverse reinforcement learning, we've observed the performance of a well-learned agent, and then estimate the reward function behind it. In doing that, we often also estimate the environmental model or the value function. So I don't have time to go into the details, but there are many strategies being proposed. For example, my former colleague Eiji Uchibe came up with the idea of using the framework of the likelihood ratio learning, for which the Masashi Sugiyama, who is talking today in the afternoon, can be utilized for more data efficient inverse reinforcement learning. Okay, so then I have talked about how to let the agent more autonomous, right? So finding out their reward function and fine tune their parameters. But there's a kind of a argument that making AI agent autonomous is dangerous, right? So having AI agents be more creative is in general a good thing. So they may be able to find new goals and then try them out, and they may be able to create like a new science or new technology or culture or even industry. But simultaneously, we have to care about the potential danger of such autonomous AI, right? So sometimes the algorithm may run away and then cause some kind of unexpected side effect, or more seriously, so such autonomous AI may be exploited by like a military country or like terrorists for like social harm, right? And in controlling the danger of such autonomous AI, I think it's important to learn from the human society. So because the AI may be dangerous, but the humans are guaranteed to be dangerous, right? So we already made many species to extinction, and we are now very close to the self-extinction due to like a nuclear war or like environmental destruction, right? And through the lot of failures and tragedies, the human society have evolved some mechanism to avoid such a catastrophe. And I think democracy is one of such a way to avoid catastrophe based on the over concentration of power to a small group or a single person, right? So in the politics, we implement election or term limit or separation of powers to avoid over concentration. And also in the economy, we have like anti-monopoly law and also the right to strike to avoid over concentration of economic power. And in science, we implemented a peer review system so that standing theory may be flipped with the development of a new theory or a new discovery. So these are kind of a very important things we should learn for the future AI. So there should be an effort to make each AI agent safe and not very bad. But even if some of the AI agent becomes bad, we should avoid the entire society is destroyed by such an agent. So what we should realize is some kind of a peer reviewing mechanism across different AI agents, and also human agent included. So in doing that, the open source and also the explainable AI agents would be very important. So exactly how we can implement it is still an open issue, but that is something I think we can learn from a lot of past history of a human society. And also the human society is built on the human brain, right? And recently there are interesting observation that the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala are working together. So the classic idea is that the old part of the brain, like amygdala, is a brutal brain, and then newer part of brain, like prefrontal cortex, is a more rational brain. But recent brain imaging finds that the kind of opposite. So people who prefer like a fair division of reward have a higher activity of the amygdala, and people who can make like a selfish decision, they have a higher activity of prefrontal cortex. Like a naive brain is a more like a favor the fairness, and then your advanced prefrontal cortex allow you to become more selfish. And a similar result has been observed for the comparing the brain volume of these prefrontal cortex and amygdala. So probably it is very important in the design of a future operating system for the AI. So build in such a favor for the fairness and then awareness for the other agents to be included. Right. Okay, so then in our project, we had like a conference of the AI and brain science, and then we produced a special issue of neural networks, and then one of the paper we drafted with Stuart Russell and the other colleagues kind of touch upon this kind of topics. So if you are interested, please check it. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for your attention and patience. So I would like to thank all the collaborators who allowed us to this kind of study in between the machine learning and the neuroscience. Thank you very much.